The Man Listening podcast is listener supported. What that means is you don't hear a bunch of ads with me trying to sell you things on the front end. It means that I do have significant expenses, and anybody who can pitch in, I'm more than appreciative. Be happy to thank you in whatever way you choose. Just go to Patreon, that's Patreon, and look for Man Listening, one word. And thanks so very much.
The alpha male that he had been, he no longer really held that stature in the relationships. When we got home, he'd have to assert.
What is the sound of one man listening? This is Man Listening, a fresh podcast featuring the stories of strong women who bounce back. Man Listening, because every woman deserves to be heard.
Hi, I'm Stuart Watson, and welcome to Man Listening. Right where I'm recording this, I have tacked up a little sign with a bunch of butterflies on it. It's a saying, almost in, not calligraphy, but it says we're all wounded in some way. What we do with our woundedness defines us. If we learn and grow from our wounds, they can motivate us to claim our going forward story. In other words, we don't have to be defined by what happened to us. In other words, we don't have to be victims. And that quote is from a woman named Tambry Harris. And she has written a book about this. Tambry is spelled Tambry, Harris. And she's today's guest. And I think this notion of being able to tell what happened to us in a completely different way is extremely powerful. If you've ever experienced it, it changes us from merely surviving a wound to thriving and living a full life. And so Tambry Harris did what a lot of people have thought about doing and have not, and that is she took Me Too to another level. She actually took action. She created an organization called Survivors to Thrivers, and she wrote a book about it, and she does workshops, and I think you'll find her story very interesting. Tambry Harris. Where were you born?
I was born in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Hospital or home?
At the hospital.
For your mother, your number what of how many?
I am the firstborn of two.
For purposes of understanding Tambry, what should I know about your mother and father?
So my mother was one of five. So she had three older brothers and one younger sister, and actually was born in Charlotte as well. So we're three generations because I have a daughter as well. So that's kind of fun. And she and the brother closest to her were the only ones that were able to go off to college. And so in some ways that was something that she was grateful for, but also heard a lot about as far as the sacrifices that were made, that kind of thing. She actually met my father at the university. She was a nursing major.
Nurse, teacher, homemaker.
Pretty much
kind
those
of the
were
big three.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so was the influence that she impressed on you the value of education? Was that
That's more my father.
Oh.
That's more my father. And so they met in college and dated. I mean, the joke was that he and my uncle were roommates. And so my dad would joke about, so a girl comes with, I knew Chapel Hill was liberal, but a girl comes with the room too, because she was helping him fix the room up. But no, so they met when my mother was still in high school.
Wow.
And then dated throughout college. After my father went off to the military, his parents were killed in a drunk driver accident. So it took him almost a week to get by. His father was killed on impact. His mother lived for a week. He just made it back before she died. And my mother was a junior at the time. And so you have this just huge trauma that happens at the beginning, kind of the beginning of their relationship.
Like when you saw kids who would go to a party and drink beers and still keep their car keys, were you like hyper vigilant because of this family story?
That's an interesting question. It more impacted me around just a sense of loss to never
Mm.
have really that side of my family. I really only had one side of my family. And so it was always just a sense of loss and a sense of, I've always been a very justice oriented person. And so the fact that nothing happened to this person, when I ask what happened to him? Well, nothing. How could that be? Well, things were just different back then. So, and I guess,
So no prison, no.
oh, no, nothing. I don't think they even charged him with anything.
Mm.
Yeah. So it was more, I kind of grew up, I guess there's a lot more awareness around consequences then. I don't really know that I didn't have that in me, I guess. One thing I did have in me was, again, I really only had one side of a family, and one of my cousins, who was probably 8 years older than me, was riding a car in the East Mac parking lot here in Charlotte. She was riding on the hood of the car. Her best friend was driving, hit the speed bump, threw her off the roof, killed her instantly.
Oh my word.
And I was 8 at the time. So that impacted me. And even with my daughter, when she started driving, I'm just like, do not do anything dumb. So I think I probably was more impacted by that loss as far as changing my behavior than the other.
Impacted you as in life is fragile, or be super safe, don't do stupid, risky things, or?
Probably the latter more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not so much. Like if someone has a family member who dies of cancer, or,
Mm-hmm.
It's like when we have these losses, we can take away, we're getting ahead of ourselves, but we tell ourselves a story,
Mm-hmm.
right, around
Mm-hmm.
the loss.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the way we process the loss. But we might tell ourselves like completely different stories around that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some people might say, well, just stuff happens. And other people it might like forever change the way they view things because of that.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned cancer. I mean, I told you there were 3 brothers. 2 of them died in their 30s of cancer. And, one with an extended battle with cancer and the other a shorter battle with cancer. So I have cousins who lost, the primary breadwinner in their families early on. And then my aunt battled it for 20 years or something, and they lost her, and then the older brother died of cancer as well. So what the impact on me with that was, I actually had survivor's guilt because I was the only one who had 2 parents. Everybody else was left with, just one parent, and a very, very painful process of losing that parent. So to your point, I process death differently than some. When I hear about somebody dying at 90 and they're all so sad, I'm thinking, we're just lucky to get to 60.
Right. Given your experience with so much loss and trauma, how do you counsel friends and people around that when you see trauma or resilience or coping with trauma become such a contest? How do you help people through that when they're saying, well, you don't see me going to bed for weeks or months at a time, and I had the same, because it's not the same.
Right. A lot of how it's shown up more for me is people saying, I know I should deal with this, but I'm not choosing to. I'm just going to let the past be the past. So it's more, and I don't try and cajole them to, no, really, you need to do your healing work. Because it's really a matter of readiness to be able to see. And I think so many times, and even in the scenario you were just describing, sometimes people, there's actually fear underneath, because if they take that lid off, it might be more than they could ever deal with or go back and contain in any kind of a way. So it's almost like, you don't see me, being emotional. You don't see me, escaping. Well, that's just them trying to push it down.
Or it might be, you don't see me going to a therapist.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. But then we get into, and see, one of the things for me is that I had created a lot of coping patterns that seemingly worked for me. And so these individuals, I was an overachiever.
Oh,
and so
got to work.
Busy.
Got
to be really busy. Got to have, and be above reproach. So I got to be perfect and got to do my best. It stemmed from an unworthiness, a sense of unworthiness. And so I had to prove myself. So you're always striving. So I mentioned being the firstborn. And again, that's the kind of role that I took on as far as the overachiever, but always had to be at the top of the class and get the A's. And again, my father was always really clear about his value set around education. So that's how I can make him happy and be the good kid. But then it continued, go. And then, so once I get my undergrad, I've got to go to grad school. And then when I get my job, I've got to be, the one performing at the best. Did you go to grad school? And I did.
Master's, PhD?
I started out as PhD, ended up with a master's.
In?
Industrial organizational psychology.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
And that's very pragmatic. That's a useful.
Yeah. Well, it was very useful. It was interesting because, and I didn't know what was underlying. And I think that's back to when we push the lid tight, we don't know what really is underlying our motivations. But I always was fascinated with psychology. And so again, when I shifted from architecture, I did my little survey course of classes, and it wasn't going to be economics and it wasn't going to be accounting. I took these classes and I'm like, well, that's painful. So I had to find something that I actually felt like I had interest in. And once I chose psychology, I knew that I didn't see myself being a counselor. And I thought, I just kind of knew that I would take that home with me. I was afraid I'd get too involved. And so then when I found out about kind of applied psychology, so you're taking the principles, but applying them to work settings, that was very appealing. And so to your point, it was a way to be in that field and be able to have a good career within that.
Now, a lot of people say, none of us get out of here alive. None of us get through this without some form of trauma. Are you a person who would agree with that? Is there anyone who gets to adulthood escaping trauma?
There's different layers. There's differing layers. And so therefore, a lot of times there's differing understanding. When I think about my story, I think we got dealt more trauma than many.
Who's we?
My family. Again, all the deaths.
All the deaths.
Yeah, all the deaths. Yeah. And, barely a year goes by without somebody young dying, and so you're just kind of in this constant cycle. So I think that some people, and it's almost like, but it gives you a lot more perspective. I mean, I have a lot more, I do leadership coaching and spiritual direction. And so, I feel like I can sit across from someone and really understand on a lot of different levels because I've lived it. I've been there. So I think that I do know some people who haven't had seemingly quite the dose of trauma, but there certainly were things. There were things in their lives that they needed to move through.
What prompted you to start working in that area, whether it's spiritually or using your psychology training? What prompted you to focus on that?
On the spiritual direction?
Well, on
or life
using your own trauma to help others or listen to others to bear witness.
Yeah. Well, we haven't hit the biggie for me yet.
What's the biggie?
The biggie is that I'm a childhood victim of sexual abuse. So that really, and that is what ties into the unworthiness piece for me. I think that it would have been bad enough had I had lived through and had the survivor's guilt and had all the hurt and pain around me. I think that would have been hard enough. But what was unfortunate was that while all that was happening, when I was around 5, someone took advantage of that situation, and just no one either saw or had the energy to do something. It's hard to know, but my child mind went to the place of, I'm not worthy of intervention. And so I endured it. for years. And that created a lot of mental mindsets for me that were unhealthy. And so, you asked me about graduate school. Well, I was in a relationship in undergraduate and we got married right when I graduated. And I had signs that he wasn't the best of people, but I excused it because I felt lucky to have been chosen. And because he was, seemingly, an impressive person. And we got off to Houston, and I'm in the PhD program, getting paid to go to school, and the Elite Five kind of thing. And he's an undergrad. He's trying to finish out his undergrad, although he's 2 years older than me. He's still trying to finish out his undergrad. And so basically, the alpha male that he had been, he no longer really held that stature in the relationship. So when we got home, he'd have to assert. And so he was very abusive. And
physically,
he would throw things and hit things around me. He rarely hit me, but it was more verbally and mentally.
Did he ever hit you?
The closest came when I had a little CRX, those little tiny cars, and Honda, yep. And he was driving, he was a big guy, 6'4", something like that, had played football for a university kind of thing. And he's a big dude. And he swiped at me and went past my face and hit the window beside me. And I was afraid it was going to shatter. That was the closest. It'd always be around me, but still that's frightening, right? And it may have been because, again, he was military police for the Marines. So he probably learned some of the almosts there too. I don't know, but he played a lot of mind games, was probably the worst things he would do.
What do you know now about, especially as a little child, about this thing happens that we don't even have we don't have words. We don't, we can't even explain it. The story, the making of a story, because that's so powerful. What the first story is, and then the whole notion that we're not stuck with that story our whole lives. Get me there. How did you learn that the story was that you weren't worthy of being intervened?
It worked for me seemingly until I was about 35, actually. I was working in corporate America and just moving up the ladder. And I actually was at a workshop. I was in human resources at a workshop of about 40 people, and they did this exercise that talked about energy and how energy can affect someone. So as they're walking through this exercise, watching the impact on that person up in front actually caused me to have a panic attack. And I had never had one before. So I was just, and if, I don't know if you've had one or not, but it's like this sense of you can barely breathe. You just can't leave the room soon enough. Just the intensity was so great. And so I waited to break. And as I'm kind of scanning the room for the safest person, found her, pulled her off at the break and, shared. And she basically encouraged me to go to counseling. And that was the start of the peeling back the layers. So I had suppressed this memory for 30 years. And that happens often for children because it's just, you said it, there were no words, there was no understanding. And so you repress it so much until something triggers that for you. So it started coming out in dreams, memories, and talking through things. And when I started figuring out the who, it was one of those, back to the stories, this is someone who was very highly esteemed, right? And so trying to reconcile what you thought was true about this person and then what your experience with this person is, trying to reconcile that. There was actually a moment where I thought, will I be able to move past this moment of reconciliation, reconciling those two worlds, those two levels of understanding, because I really thought it might just be too much for me to take in. I had a wonderful therapist who knew how to helped me stay grounded while we were working through all of this, who stair-stepped me well. She
Ask the right questions.
Asked the right questions and didn't push me too far. Because I think, and that was one of the things, sometimes I would say, Edith, let's just tear off the Band-Aid and get through this awareness. And she's like, no, it doesn't work that way. And so and for me, and this is something that was a real big piece, was really connecting my mind, body, and spirit around all of this, because and I think a lot of survivors of sexual abuse, you kind of separate your head from your body because your body's been violated. And so all you can do is live in your head. So to kind of begin to own your body and listen to it is so very, very important. And so
powerful.
It is. And so, it took me years, and that's something that can be encouraging and discouraging from anyone who has a similar story, because, on one hand, to hear it's going to take years, it's like, do I really want to go through that? But on the other hand, it's encouraging to know I've been at this for a while and I'm still working on stuff. And the answer is, yeah, it takes a while.
There's a saying in recovery: the good news is you feel your feelings. The bad news is you feel your feelings. And the good news is you're not dead inside.
Well, that's the piece. And that's where the beauty comes in the ability to relate and be able to sit with others. And one of the things that really bothered me when I was in corporate America was we did this exercise and people were supposed to give descriptions of you. And some of the descriptions I got were professional. And I'm thinking, well, that's not real exciting. I would rather be, witty or, something insightful or something like that, but professional. But that was the armor that I had put up to survive. And so now my hope is that I am authentic and real and whatever, heart-led, however you want to describe me, but please don't describe me as just professional, right?
That's like a mask.
It is. Saying. Oh, it was. It was very much.
So when did you get a kind of a breakthrough to be able to say, okay, that was the story.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do I change the story?
Right. I had, I don't know if you've heard the term parallel process, but I had some parallel processing going on.
I don't know what that means.
So that means that two things are happening at the same time. And so not only am I going through therapy and learning to process things mentally and physically, my faith was deepening at the same time. And so
what is your faith?
I'm Methodist.
Oh, okay.
And I always, and I grew up in the church and had, belief, faith and all that kind of stuff, but I didn't have a real deep relationship with God. And that's what I wanted. And so it was, 18 years ago, I joined a women's group that was our intent, was to really begin to deepen our faith together. And it was a study we did, and it was incredible. And then we just kept doing more and more studies, and we're still meeting. We met last night. So we still meet. And
how many women and what did you do? Because when people say deepen their faith, I don't know what that looks like.
That's a great question. So we try and keep the group 7 or less.
Smart.
Because that way it really creates sacred space. Everybody is, the space physically is intimate, and what can be shared is intimate. The study we did was called Companions in Christ. And it was a study that really allowed you to look at your relationship with God and look at where has God been on your path. I will tell you, so sometimes at church, you'll hear a scripture and, they'll want you to memorize the scripture or whatever. So I'd always, you listen to the sermon and they tell you, whatever you're supposed to take away from the sermon. In Companions in Christ, we would use an approach called Lectio Divina, which means divine text. And so what you do is when I first learned about it, it said we are raised to master text. So you think about when you're at school, you're learning it, you're mastering it, you can answer questions, you can regurgitate what you learned. With Lectio Divina, you allow the text to master you.
How?
You allow the words that you're reading and say, well, how does that apply to my life? Or what word lifts off the page for me? What am I supposed to hear out of this to apply to my life. What might God be saying to me through this?
So you say that as a prayer? Do you say, God, show me what?
Often.
And when you say the question, where was God in my life?
Mm-hmm.
Give me an example after you went through this intensive prayer and
Mm-hmm.
group
Mm-hmm.
that you were, give me a specific example of where you recognized the presence of God in your life
Mm-hmm. upon
reflection that you didn't realize when you were in it.
I have one that happened this week. It fast forwards a little bit to talk about. Was that okay?
Sure.
Okay.
I mean, yeah.
So I wrote this book about my life, and my intent was to help other survivors of abuse. And you asked earlier about, when did you really felt led to do this work? And it was really with the hashtag #MeTooHands. I started thinking, I've got a story to share and to encourage others who might feel stuck. So I've had this effort and this movement on my heart for 3 years, and I have been dedicating my life and in some ways, my career to this work. And so I developed retreats and yet nobody came because it's such a hard topic to come out around. And I did all these different things. And long story short, I wrote the book and I've been trying to launch it. And so I've had 2 big book launches. And I had one where I invited professionals and faith leaders and therapists, doctors, and I recorded it. Not as many people came as I had hoped. And then no one contacted me. The whole idea was, if you're joining me, let me thank you. And I'd love to send you a book just to kind of know who's engaged, or do you have other avenues that you want me to reach out to? Nobody engaged. And I was just really downhearted. And so
I know that feeling. I can relate already.
Yeah. And so right now my companions group is, we're in the season of Advent. And so the first week is hope. And the second week is faith. And so part of it is asking God to show you where He is, even when you don't feel it, And so I've been praying that, and I've been saying, I'm feeling really dejected around all this outreach and very little outcome. And I'm asking my companions to pray for me about my spirit, because I was really struggling with some of this. And all of this is happening, and I'm journaling. Oh, and I decided, okay, on Tuesday morning, I woke up and I thought, you know what? I've got renewed energy. I'm going to send out those follow-up emails, and I'm going to reach out, and this is great. And I look in my email box, and I had heard from the publisher that I won 2020 finalist for Best Book Award.
Congratulations.
That had been happening, right? Even when I was feeling down, even when it's like things are happening, you don't even know it. And then it comes to be, and I was finding hope and encouragement in other ways, but that was a biggie, right? I mean, that was just such a big praise, because I think, wow, now even more people can become aware of it and see it as a resource. So, but all along, having my companions to share my doubts and share my concerns and share, and in my readings, like with Lectio Divina, it's, sharing the readings where it's talking about, having faith even when you can't see what's happening behind the scenes. And so I was praying about, help me have faith when I don't know what's happening behind the scenes. And then I find out this really big thing, what's happening behind the scenes that whole time. Another example is that I, again, same discouraged period. And I finally went and looked at an email on my Facebook, which I'm real bad about. And there was a Facebook message from somebody who had sent it on the 23rd. I just hadn't seen it in that week. And it was, I bought your book. I can't wait to send it to a friend of mine who just got out of a violent marriage, and I want to give it to her as a gift. Will you sign it? So again, there's encouraging things that are happening, but I have to engage and be present and be open to all these different pieces.
I'm reading a text from 100 years ago that a woman who was on the podcast recommended to me. Well, she recommended another one that recommended this one.
Mm.
It's kind of pulling the thread, you know. I'm reading a text that talks about how words are important, that words are the way that human beings activate their faith, or they activate these powers, you know, spiritual powers. And it sounds like your faith is, there's power in prayer. There's power in articulating our requests. That's what I'm taking away from what you're saying, is that.
Yeah. And also, so another example would be back to your word thing.
Yes.
When I joined this group, there was one woman who brought a desire to, when we opened, to go around the circle. And, you know, I would look at you and say, Stuart, I'm a beloved child of God, just like you. And then you would say it to the person beside. And it kind of is a way to invite everyone into the circle claiming their belovedness.
Now you're looking me in the eye when you say that. And I find that to be very important. Do you? I mean,
well, what was back to the words? I would say, Stuart, I'm a beloved child of God like you. And I would emphasize the like you, because I couldn't claim my own belovedness.
I see.
Because I want that for you, and I believe it in you, and I want you to know that. But as someone who had a lifetime of feeling unworthy, I couldn't own that for myself.
Do you ever do that in the mirror? Do you ever look yourself in the eye?
That is an interesting question. I have not. I've gotten past that though. I have claimed it, and it feels amazing. But again, it took a long time to finally be able to accept that.
Do you look yourself in the eye in the mirror when you put on makeup?
More it's focused on like, okay, I'm doing my eyelashes or whatever. It's not really taking in my spirit. Do you ever look yourself in the
eye in the mirror?
Not really.
You know, in the depths of my addiction, I would shave and not look myself in the mirror. Not just because I did not love that guy, but because I loathed that guy. You know, I mean, I just see you as one of God's children, but that's easy, you know, to see this beautiful, capable person. It's just so difficult to see in ourselves.
You know, as you were talking, I thought about, and this would be kind of a practice that we would have done to deepen ourselves in companions, is also just the ability to just let that soak in. Because you were talking about being able to look yourself in the eye, but I also think about just sitting here right now and allowing that knowing and that belief to kind of soak into your body, into your bones, into your spirit. And allow that to be real for you versus just in your head. That's been part of my work, and that's part of my gift now, that as you were saying those things, I could just feel my body just sensing that peace of, oh, isn't it nice to be here now? To know that. Have you gotten there? You said that's been part of your work around accepting.
It's a struggle. How do you, like as particular as you can, how do you shift the story? Like when you recognize what the story was,
yes, that
I'm unworthy of being loved and, you know, cared for. Once you recognize it, it's kind of awful. It's kind of an awful story. I mean, I have my own story of unworthiness. How do you ever, having recognized what the primary narrative is, how do you ever change the story, change the words, change the narrative?
So I think the first step is to recognize those limiting beliefs that do exist within you, because I think sometimes they're just so part of our DNA, we don't even see them. So I'm unworthy. I didn't really know that per se. I just knew that I was a striver and a perfectionist and I had to achieve. It took a while for me to even recognize that unworthiness was underneath that. Another one of mine was, I need to stay small. And I always knew that I didn't want to be out in front. I didn't want people to know the grades I was getting, all that kind of stuff. I didn't know the why behind it. And so the first thing is recognizing what they are. And sometimes that's a matter of just almost getting quiet and hearing, what are those tapes? What are those mind monsters that come up for us, and asking the question, is that working for you? How's that working for you? And if the answer is, well, not very well, start asking the questions around, well, is it true? So is it true that you're not worthy? Really? What's your evidence for that? Really looking it in the eye as you would almost I actually have people write in the third person, because that helps you become more objective. So, Tambry considered herself to be unworthy. She found this unworthiness led her to accept bad behavior. Well, gosh, when I see that, it's like, well, Tambry needs to get her act together and accept what I mean. And so I would say, to the degree you can look at that situation objectively and say, what's behind that? Oh, it's because of the fact that, and so once you start naming what is not working for you, what it would look like if you flipped it around. So I'm worthy. And from a psychological perspective, we have core beliefs that lead us into thought patterns that lead us into actions. So I'm not worthy means I have to earn my love and worth. And then these are the things I do. Well, if I am worthy, then that leads me to the belief of I can show up as my authentic self and be. And then my behaviors are completely different. I need to stay small. Well, that probably was something that was a survival instinct for me when I was little. But now what if I don't need to stay small anymore? Oh, then I can say yes to a speaking engagement. Oh, I can actually tell my story. That's been a big piece for me. I can actually tell my story. I can put a voice to that. So no longer am I the person, so back to reclaiming who you are and what you want your next chapter to be. Yes, all these other chapters are part of who I am. I will always be a victim of childhood abuse. I will always be a domestic abuse survivor. But I also, so my chapters are that I was a member of this Companions in Christ group that deepened my faith. And now my current chapter is I'm someone who wants to share her story to bring hope and encouragement to others. And so I always talk about your next chapter, your current chapter, your next chapter, and what you want your going forward story to be. Because some of these things, like with you, like with me when we were little, some of that parts of our stories were written for us. But now as adults, we can begin to look at it and really decide, okay, what do I need to do to really understand what led to some of those stories, and how do I want to claim my going forward story and really begin to write some of those chapters.
Do you really think we have the power to write what the next chapter is? Or is it a matter of discovering it?
Well, maybe that's your next chapter, is discovery. I want to be in a place of discovery, I will say that, these past 3 years are nothing that I plotted out. I did not plot them at all. They have evolved, and I have really moved into what I felt like I was being led to do. And I almost feel like I was stair-stepped in small ways, because if I had known in the end what I was doing, I would have said thanks, but no thanks, because it's much bigger. I'm certain,
So you're saying you felt led to write the book?
I felt led to start the organization. So I started an organization called Going Forward Survivors to Thrivers to support the survivors of sexual abuse. So the website, the survivorstothrivers.com website, the retreats, the one-on-one coaching, all of that was happening. And that was kind of preparing me. And in all of that, I'm telling my story more. I'm starting to be asked to speak. And so it all kind of evolved in some ways. But what I did choose in that chapter is that I have done my work. I feel fortunate to have moved from what I call surviving to thriving, and I want to support others in that space. that's my next chapter. I mean, I couldn't have told you what, paragraph 4 was going to be, but I knew that was going to be the next chapter. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so I think that people have the ability to begin to, at least again, I mean, maybe the next chapter is that I'm ready to really look at my limiting beliefs and really question, really give myself the opportunity for personal growth. I mean, that could be the next chapter.
There's that phrase, the still small voice of God.
Mm.
And I find that my ego drowns that out.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever its fears are, or whatever its obsession or desire or fame, fortune, whatever, it always drowns that out. So what I'm wondering is, you've done work in terms of prayer and reflection and working with an intimate group of women to get led, to feel led.
Mm-hmm.
That is a very different process than I'm going to get a master's degree, or I'm going to get married, or I'm going to make $1 million. What does that process look like for you of making yourself quiet to be able to hear a still small voice?
Mm-hmm. One of my things that is a constant for me that I have to watch is my striving. I'm a big striver. And so one of the things I always say is, what's my part and what's God's part? Because I'm going to strive. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do all these things. And then sometimes in my striving, I don't give space for that small voice to speak to me. So I think part of it's an awareness around my tendency and then openness to that. I mean, I will tell you, when I had it put on my heart that I needed to do something for the #MeToo voices or hands that I saw going up, every morning I'd go and I have like quiet, you can call it meditation time, you can call it whatever you want, but prayer time. But I mean, I would go quiet and say, what is this, God? What are you trying to tell me here? And it took me 2 months to get an answer. And it came through the paper where, oh my goodness, Judy Schindler, rabbi here in Charlotte, she said, it was right before the Women's March in December, and she said, we need more than a march, we need a movement. And I had read that, and I went up to prayer, and I heard, that's what I'm asking. I want a movement around support for women who have survived sexual abuse. I want you to help use your experience, your expertise. And in some ways it made perfect sense because I've got the master's in psychology. I'm a spiritual director. I'm a leadership coach. I lead retreats. I mean, I have all those elements. And so it made perfect sense. Now, has it been easy to come into? No, there's, it's because of this population, but it was really, I think it takes discipline to be able to not know that, okay, I'm sitting here, let the insight come right now. I think sometimes you have to be open to it coming to you from a variety of different ways. And sometimes I hear it through other people. Well, I even think about, how you and I met, and you just never know why people are put in your path around different things. And so I don't know. If I'm answering your question.
Well, there are people, and I ask this again and again and again, and I get all, there's not a right or wrong answer.
Yeah. When
people are in your path and it gets to be this sort of coincidence, do you make of that I manifested it, I attracted it, God is afoot, God is somewhere in this, or we're random molecules and it was completely meaningless and nothing means anything? I have a sentence, it's not D, but do you think we do it? That we make meaning, God makes meaning, or everything's meaningless? I mean,
I think there's probably more opportunities than we even realize sometimes because we aren't being still and recognizing. But there's just too many interesting things that happen that I was on the list to go to help out at Dove's Nest here in Charlotte for a long, couple of years. And it just didn't work out. And now all of a sudden I'm asked to speak there at a time where my message is even stronger than it would have been 2 years ago. And so the timing was just a wonderful timing. So did I take action because the opportunity presented itself? Yes. But the fact that the opportunity even came to be in me is kind of an interesting story in and of itself. So I think that we have to be open to those times and places. So we do have that actor part of it, but I do also believe that, God's putting out beautiful opportunities all the time. I can't tell you the number of just things that come into my life where I'm just like, wow, that's really interesting. I can't believe that just happened.
Looking over your shoulder, there's a bluebird on the branch out there.
I think there's something symbolic about bluebirds, isn't there?
Well, there are people, not the Christian tradition, but there are people of traditions all over the world who make something of birds as...
Yes. Well, and bluebirds in particular, I think are supposed to. So,
Yeah. Well, they're beautiful birds. Yeah, it's nice. What am I missing? Tell me what this quote is that you had done.
Yeah, so I did a Kickstarter launch for the book to try and help fund it. And I had an artist in Pembroke, North Carolina, who is a survivor herself. She just graduated from art school. And she took one of my quotes and it says, "We are all wounded in some way. What we do with our woundedness defines us. If we learn and grow from our wounds, they can motivate us to claim our going forward story." And that's a quote from the book. And we made it into some artwork to share with donors and that type of thing. So I wanted you to have a copy to say thank you for the opportunity to be on your podcast. But I guess that's what my hope is that everybody sees. My hope is that in listening to what we've talked about, that they are encouraged to do their healing work and to look at whatever might be holding them back from their best life and to claim that next chapter, to claim that going forward story.
I honor your journey.
Thank you.
And I value your time, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tambry. Tambry's book is called Awakening the Light. Awakening the Light. It's published by Spark Publications, the same folks who published my book, What She Said and What I Heard. And that's where I met Tambry, and I'm very grateful I did because we share some things in common having to do with trauma and the belief that trauma does not have to define us. Thank you, Tambry.
Man Listening is a production of Unmediated LLC in cooperation with the Queen City Podcast Network and Balto Creative Media. Allison Andrews at Andrews Creative and Rachel Clapp-Miller are developmental producers. Sally Higgins at Higgins & Owens tries to keep us legal. Our music is A Day at the Park by the group Pictures of the Floating World. Your announcer is Catherine Smith. That's me. Please go to our Patreon page. You'll find us at patreon.com. Look for Man Listening, one word, no spaces. We hope you'll join us by becoming a member. A small investment can raise up the conversation. If you want exclusive member merch like a t-shirt, we can arrange that too.
A big old shout out and thank you to everyone who supports Man Listening through Patreon or wherever and however you do. I'll never forget you. I really appreciate it.
Don't forget to support us at Patreon. We believe one voice can change the conversation. Click the subscribe button, and next week you'll hear.
I figured out I was queer, which took a little while. And then I went to Russia, where it is illegal to be gay. So that was great. That was a good choice.
That's next week on Man Listening. Thanks.